Patryk Kugiel, and on behalf of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, I would like to welcome everyone, the speakers, the participants, and the audience watching us on YouTube to this timely webinar on Afghanistan, Taliban, and migration. I believe this is very critically important topic at the moment for a number of reasons. On the one hand, we all know that there are thousands of Afghans left in the country who are feeling threatened by the Taliban and who are desperate to exit the country, to run away from the persecution or oppression or even poverty. But on the other hand, however, we have also very serious concerns and many people in the region, but also in Europe, who are seriously afraid of a new large-scale migration out of Afghanistan. So the question is how we can reconcile and balance these two approaches and concerns, and how does the situation look like in Afghanistan these days under the Taliban, and how it can evolve in the future, and how it will impact the migration patterns. And finally, whether are we facing new migration or refugee crisis in Afghanistan, and also what the European Union and international community can do to react to this challenge. I'm happy that we have we will discuss this subject with some of the best experts on Afghanistan, experts with deep knowledge of the country, but also years or if not decades of experience and presence in Afghanistan. So I'm looking forward to learn a lot from their insights. The panel will be shortly presented by Morten Boas from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, which is a partner institution of ours. But before I hand over to Morten, I just want to inform you that this webinar is part of the larger research project called MediaShare. The project is run by NUPI and PISM and is supported by Iceland, supported financially by Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway through the EEA grants and Norway grants. And as coordinator of this project, I just want to explain briefly the MediaShare stands for Migration and Development Sharing Knowledge between Norway and Poland. And this is 2 years long research endeavor in which we were trying to understand what is the role of development assistance in addressing root causes of migration. And as we are nearing the end of the project, you can expect a number of publications being published in coming weeks, including the final report. So if you are interested also in migration and development linkages, then stay tuned. And now, without further delay, I would invite Morten Boas to chair the session, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks to our three panelists that we have today, which is Thomas Ruttig, which is the co-director of the Afghanistan Analyst Network, which is an independent, non-for-profit policy research organization, which covers among many things also the migration flow in and out of, but also within Afghanistan. Thomas has published extensively about Afghanistan and the wider region that Afghanistan is part of. Thomas's intervention will be followed by one from Arne Strand. Arne is a research director at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen. And he has worked for decades on various issues concerning Afghanistan and published extensively on Afghanistan, and also have years, if not decades, of experience in field work in Afghanistan. So we are very well served with Thomas and Arne as our two key Afghanistan experts on this in this webinar. Finally, we have mine and Patrick's joint colleague, Jolanta Susmanska. Jolanta is a political scientist, and she coordinates the European Union program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, that's PISM, our new peace partner in this particular project. And she works on migration policy issues and other linked issues to the European Union's both internal and external affairs. We should have a brilliant set of speakers on this panel. I will very soon hand it over to first Thomas, but just to say that, I mean, Taliban has been, and Afghanistan has of course been an issue for the international community to grapple with for years and decades, and there is extremely many really good reasons to look back at the whole sort of international Afghan engagement and what has happened and what has not happened, and how was it possible that senior intelligence officers in in NATO and other like-minded organizations and countries could be so terribly wrong when it came to how quickly Taliban was able to take power in Kabul. But leaving that beside, I mean, I think what is interesting here is to sort of discuss what does the Taliban takeover mean, and how will it affect both Afghanistan in itself, how will it affect neighboring countries, but also to what extent will the Taliban takeover affect the global refugee situation? And there are several question marks behind each of these questions, because we do not know this for certain yet, but I'm very certain that we will be enlightened through the interventions of our three speakers. So I'm not going to use any more time right now. I very much look forward to this, to what I think will be three brilliant interventions. And I look forward to learning even more about Afghanistan, a country that I have visited, but not worked intimately on. And before I hand it over to first Thomas, for just a little bit of housekeeping for our listening participants, we will try to make room for a Q&A session towards the end. Please use the chat function if you have questions that you would like to pose, because it's much easier than the raise hand function. So please use the chat functions, post your Q&A there, and I will screen this regularly to see relevant questions, and then I will take relevant questions and address it to either to the panel as a whole or to one specific member of the panel. With that said, Thomas, the floor is yours, and please try to stick to the time we have agreed, and I will send you a reminder in the chat function when you are closing in on it. So without further ado, Thomas Ruttig, the floor is yours. You are muted, Thomas.
No, that started very well already. I'm sorry for that. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Morten, and also thank you very much to the two institutes for the invitation. It's nice to be part of a trans-European endeavor on Afghanistan. Not the first one, but in a completely new situation. And I will mainly look at this new situation, not look back that much, because that would be a much longer endeavor to speak about why we ended up and why, first of all, Afghans ended up in that very dire situation as currently. I just want to add one sentence to what Morten said about the probably intelligence failure, about how quickly everything unraveled. after 20 years of reconstruction in Afghanistan. I think the question we should add to that is also, how could it be possible that it collapsed so profoundly? Because there's not much left of what has been done in the last 20 years, at least as far as I see it. When we look at the current situation in Afghanistan and the Taliban in power, I would say there are two major points to it. The first one is that the Taliban takeover of power seems to be final and complete. They have de facto taken over the whole country, and there's no remaining political alternative to them, which is to a large part due to the fact that the Taliban do not accept any opposition. What we have seen after 15th August, when the Taliban marched unopposed into Kabul, that of course there's dissent, mainly by women who protest against one of the first measures of the Taliban, namely banning them again from wide spheres of the public and of the working sphere. I will come back to that a little bit later, but it's almost as surprising how completely the old government and its institutions have disappeared, showing that all the efforts and endeavors and investments over the last 20 years actually created a bubble which could have been blown with the stick of one needle. We do not have any civil society organizational structures left over. Also, representative bodies like the parliament completely disappeared. Some armed resistance, which started in the Panjshir Valley, in the smallest of the 34 Afghan provinces, remained isolated and also collapsed despite some brave statements still exchanged on the social media. What's even more important, also when we look back, is that the anti-Taliban warlords also turned out to be powers without power. Their militias, tens of thousands of armed people, also mainly gave up without any serious resistance and disintegrated. And the warlords themselves fled abroad. Again, one must say, because that has already been the situation in the mid-1990s when the Taliban swept to power for the first time. And an exile government, which the resistance in the Panjshir and also some of the warlords had been announced. There even was an announcement that such an government in exile already exists by the Afghan embassy in Switzerland, but we do not have any more knowledge about that. Is probably just the attempt of the old elites who were part of the failure of the system which was attempted to be built in the last 20 years to extend their grip on power, but I don't think we will see much coming out of that. On the military side, there's of course the Afghan branch of the Islamic State, of Daesh as the Afghans call it, the Islamic State Khorasan province, which continues to exist and has already demonstrated several times that it still is potentially able to carry out terrorist attacks. The largest one was the one during the evacuation on Kabul airport, where around almost 200 people died and many others were injured at the gates of Kabul airport, also hitting mainly Afghans, but also some killing some US soldiers. And we had the attack at Kabul's Eidgah Mosque a couple of days ago, where there was a mourning ceremony for the mother of the Taliban speaker, Zabiullah Mujahid, and someone blew himself up. Before, we had a couple of smaller attacks on Taliban patrols, Taliban cars in the provinces, mainly in Nangarhar in eastern Afghanistan, also in Kabul. But despite that potential to pull through more terrorist attacks. I do not see ISKP as a strategic challenge for the Taliban, more like an element to bother them and keep them on their toes. And the important point why I say that is that ISKP, which had some backing in Afghanistan, mainly amongst some disgruntled sub-tribal groups in eastern Afghanistan, and with the small Salafi communities which exist there, has actually disappeared. Those Salafi communities in Nangarhar and Kunar, Nuristan had welcomed ISKP in the beginning and gave them shelter. But when the regime of ISKP turned out as very, very brutal, much more brutal than that of the Taliban, even the Salafis turned against ISKP and called then government troops and the Taliban to help, and they actually took over, abolished, destroyed the bases which existed in those areas. So there are some remnant groups apparently active in the underground in Kabul, probably other provinces, but as I said, I don't see that they are able to really challenge the Taliban rule countrywide. That's one thing. So the Taliban being in the saddle again and largely unchallenged, this apart from political dissent, which also doesn't have any institutional, let's call it resonance room, because the institutions all broke down, civil society, political parties, parliament, etc. We also see that the Taliban show a lot of weakness because they have so far not been able to consolidate in the sense that they are carrying out a form of governance which actually lets the country calm down, not only from conflict, but mainly also because of the socioeconomic crisis in which the country has been for a long time, both for weaknesses in the economy, in the rebuilding of the economy in the last 20 years, and then exacerbated not only by the corona pandemics, but also by the drought events which happen in Afghanistan ever more quickly and more frequently than before. I mean, we had frequent droughts since at least the 1960s in Afghanistan, but the sequence actually has accelerated, and that's very concerning. What the Taliban have done so far is they have established a government which is not as inclusive as they said in the beginning, although the term inclusiveness also needs to be discussed. I won't do that here. Maybe we can come back to that in the Q&A round. What we see so far is that it is a government of mullahs, which is not almost entirely, which is not completely surprising. That was actually to expect because the Taliban put a lot of emphasis on showing that there's continuity in their rule also over those 20 years where they were out of power, the last 20 years. We see that there's a lot of personal continuity. Many of the ministries are led by Taliban leaders who have already been active and in key positions before 2001. And in some cases, as with the defense minister, Mullah Muhammad Yaqub, we have the son of Taliban founder, Mullah Muhammad Omar, and also other people who have followed, so to say, in a dynastic principle after their fathers who either have died or are not active anymore. What I had expected, and many observers and analysts had expected, is that the Taliban actually would make true on statements they had been disseminating for many years during their return to the battlefield and also to control over already large parts of the country, namely that they would continue to work with those people who work in the government apparatus and those educated in the country in order to make sure that the state continues to function. But in practice, it looks quite different. As before 2001, they seem to look more at let's call it outward signs of what stands for their ideology and morality, which reaches from how people can or cannot cut their beards to the use of mobile phones and televisions. But it is only the surface. There are also very clear political signals what their rule will again signify, as it has been the case before 2001, which is namely or mainly the division of genders, now also at the high schools, universities. I mean, at higher education at the universities, we already had segregation between boys and girls in most of the schools before university. And also in a very symbolic step that they not only abolished the Ministry of Women Affairs, which had been established with a clear purpose to get closer to women emancipation, equal rights after 2001, not only by abolishing this ministry, but also putting their moral police, as it very often was called in the media, the Ministry for Vice and Virtue, prevention of vice and promotion of virtue, as they call it, Amr bil Maruf, into the same building, which shows that they also know how to do symbolic policies, namely telling the West by that, and also Afghans, of course, by that step that women's rights are not figuring that high in their agenda, but what they see as Islamic morality, which then also includes the Purda, the gender separation principle. Another striking example of how the Taliban think was the statement of the new Minister of Higher Education, who told actually all those people who got access to better education during the last 20 years that they are not desired to run the Taliban state. He said, and I quote, those who completed schools and graduated from universities in the past 20 years could not be expected to deliver. Delivering apparently meaning in the sense how the Taliban would see that. And continuing the quote, nothing could be expected from the product, namely them, of the past 20 years. And that also shows the total rejection, also not unexpected, of everything what has been attempted between 2001 and this August. At the same time also, and that's also part of what I would describe as a weakness of the new Taliban regime, is that apparently the Taliban leadership in the various areas and provinces, sometimes even in districts and towns or villages, very often approach one, let's call it political issue like education or the use of TV, mobile phones differently. So there's a lot of autonomy, which would be putting it positively, but more negatively, as it is probably the case, that there's not a firm grip of the Taliban leadership, of the government in Kabul and their leadership council, which is still more or less not in hiding, that would be the wrong word, but not publicly visible, and probably based in Kandahar, that they are actually either not able or not willing really to rein those different approaches in and actually establish clearly visible political lines, also lines of command of control. One other example I wanted to mention, how total the break between the old government and the Taliban, the new Taliban regime was that they then, after 1 month after they were in power, kicked out the Minister for Public Health, Mr. Majrou, who actually had shown quite a degree of competency leading the country or helping to lead the country through the corona pandemics, and who remained in office actually for a month after the Taliban took over. But then when the new cabinet came in, he also was told to leave. And actually that probably would have been a chance for the Taliban to show to Afghans and the international community that they actually are interested in competent policies, and even if it's about public health, which you could declare it as a technocratic thing, but even there a line was drawn, and the former minister had to leave to abroad. Apparently, that's what the Taliban said. And we also see this kind of lack of leadership in the central Taliban, leadership in Kabul and Kandahar, in a number of other events, or how should I say, and also types of behavior. It starts with the fact that, and that's confirmed by many people we still are able to talk to in Kabul, that's never clear who is actually playing the police under the Taliban. Is it really their fighters, or are these criminal groups which have haunted Kabul for many years in a rather systematic way under the old government, also with political protection? And we even have reports of IDPs, internally displaced people from the Pashtun community in Kabul, who probably disarmed the police or some policemen, and then pretend to be Taliban, and do house searches and confiscation of cars and so on. And that has led for a lot of anxiety amongst the population, and also for a lack of clarity whether the Taliban are policing or whether there is a large element of chaos. And it really points to the latter. And for example, Defense Minister Mullah Yaqub, and more recently also the new Prime Minister Mullah Muhammad Hassan Rahmani, came out with decrees saying that no one in the Taliban can do house searches, and it needs to be authorized, but that actually hasn't changed anything. And it seems that a lot of people are able to do whatever they want. And it leads to also very frightening examples, as what we just heard through a reportage from German news magazine Der Spiegel, that Taliban and landowners from former periods of government are going and kicking out farmers from the land which they had acquired. I mean, AN has followed for many years this topic that different governments and regimes in the different periods of the more recent Afghan history. Let's start from the kingdom, which ended in the 1970s, had handed out land tenure documents, which then were overruled by later governments, which led to a lot of chaos and also armed conflict in many areas. And usually in those conflicts, those win who have the best political connections, and that's now those people who actually have either worked with the Taliban or are able to mobilize a relationship in the Taliban. And what Spiegel reported about that was a case in a valley in Daikundi province, very remote and difficult to reach. And that's also one example for another feature we are facing in the moment in Afghanistan, that we actually mainly, if at all, know what's happening is from Kabul and some of the larger cities, but we do not have much access to the countryside, and it's mainly due to remaining Afghan and foreign journalists who remain in Kabul and in the country, and from time to time are able to travel, that we at least hear a few things what happened beyond Kabul's border. But that will continue to be a big problem because on the basis of not really confirmed reports from the countries, also rumors and all kind of stories are blooming, as what we experienced even before the Taliban took over Kabul, with the alleged letters by the Taliban that young women had to who are not married or who are widows had to register for remarrying in the areas, which turned out to have happened in one area of Afghanistan on the initiative of a local mullah, probably positive vis-a-vis the Taliban, but definitely not the Taliban policy. It sounded more like what ISKP had done, and in those areas in eastern Afghanistan when they still were ruling there. Apart from the political situation and also the, let's call it the government chaos, which probably the last word is not spoken about, but the more time passes, and we are now almost 2 months after the takeover of the Taliban, the chance is also getting dimmer that the Taliban leadership really gets the country into their own grip, but we need to see. What is almost more concerning is, of course, that the socio-economic situation is really going into even larger crisis, and that's of course mainly due to the fact that many governments have decided that first the US government has decided to freeze Afghan money reserves, which have largely been abroad, and not give the Taliban government access to it to continue running the government. And that also many of our governments, including my own in Germany, have decided not to hand out long-term development money. What is, of course, continuing, because that's an internationally accepted principle, is humanitarian help. But of course, that's all very short-term, has been done over the past 20 years also, and was only able to bring the Afghan population over the most intense crisis, but it will not improve the socioeconomic situation at all. And that's, of course, an open question how that should be handled, and maybe we can discuss this later. I mean, we still have that people in Afghanistan therefore do not have access to the money they have been earning. I mean, those who have been working in the government, also in NGOs, even AN's own people had been, let's say, persuaded by the donors to open accounts in the Afghan banking system, which was a story of its own with a lot of scandals and money disappearing and so on. And now for them, that money in the end has disappeared because there's no cash money in Afghanistan, only very little. And for most of the time until now, people were only able to withdraw 200 in US dollars, $200 per week. Of course, in local currency in Afghani. And that apparently now we hear has been a little bit upped, but still there are long queues, and many people really can't make it to their accounts and to the ATM. And very often the cash money reserve there is over when it's their term. At the same time, salaries have not been paid. The Taliban have now announced that they will start doing it. It's unclear from what money they will use for that. Many there are some other countries in the Islamic world who help them, but that's just a speculation. I can't explain it otherwise. We see that many people are forced to sell the last household goods they have been holding on to in order to be able to buy food for the families. We have many people still who fled from the fighting when the Taliban were taking over district after district and province after province, camping in Kabul and some of the other big cities. And food prices are going up. EU said up to 50%, and that's not only it's not only food stuff, but also cooking gas and things like that, which makes it very, very difficult for people to survive. And UNDP has warned if that situation is not turned around, if the economy is not getting into gear again by the mid of next year, 2022, 97% of Afghans might live under the poverty line. In the moment, it's somewhere between 70 and 90%, according to whom you ask, World Bank or UN, etc. Another problem is also that there is the danger of a collapse of energy power provision to Afghanistan. It seems that the Taliban are not able, or partly also unwilling, to pay the debt of the former government to the neighboring countries of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, who provide around, together with Iran, provide around 70% of electricity to Afghanistan, and blackouts already increasing, and people are without energy then, and then which also makes it very difficult in that situation to talk to their relatives who are either IDPs or outside of the country or wherever, pushed into other areas as a result of the fighting. And as I said before, that's just about the cities. We can't say much about really the rural areas. Yeah, and probably also these socioeconomic issues are a topic around which dissent with the Taliban could crystallize in the longer term, I would say. We have seen very courageous and spontaneous demonstrations also against the shortage of money when people were not able to get to their bank accounts and so on. But of course, the Taliban have used violence and have introduced a regime of prior registration, saying that's also something which you have in the West, so don't complain about it. And which has actually led to the fact that we have seen less protest over the past few weeks, unless I have missed it. Yeah.
Thomas,
I think time is also almost exhausted.
Yes, if you have some final sort of last comment on 30 seconds or something.
Okay, let's do this 30 seconds. On migration, yes, of course, I mean, it goes without saying that the breakdown of the government, the takeover of the Taliban has led to a new phase in the Afghan migration crisis, which was already ongoing for many years. We should not forget that most people first flee inside of the country before they become refugees and cross borders and come to our areas. It's absolutely understandable that many people want to leave the country, even if not qualifying for political asylum because they have been harassed personally by the Taliban or anyone else. But I think the perspective that your children will live under a regime where even if you are studied, you will not be able to get a proper employment, or probably even are harassed because you are seen as Western influenced when you have education, is absolutely understandable. At the same time, I personally speaking feel the fear of a new refugee wave. I put that in very strong quotation marks in Europe is overblown, because if you look at the figures this year, and I mean, a lot of people were already fleeing for the approaching Taliban. We had probably 4-digit numbers of people who only reached Greece, and that's not yet, I mean, geographically it's Europe, but practically it's not Europe, so they're not coming to our countries. We have very effectively put up walls and razor wire, which leaves a lot of Afghans stranded, and you in Poland know that very well, looking at the situation at the border with Belarus. And the last point I want to make, that's one sentence, is what we also should not forget when we talk about migration and Afghanistan is that our governments, are to a large extent responsible for this breakdown of the Afghan government, of the, I don't want to call it an experiment of the last 20 years, but of what has been attempted over the past 20 years. And now closing our eyes vis-a-vis the real direct victims of that large failure, I find even immoral.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you so much for enlightening introduction into Afghanistan and Taliban, and also finally to the issue of the Afghan migration crisis. So thanks so much for that. I'm now going to just hand it straight over to Arne Strand. Arne Strand, are you there?
I'm here and I'm ready. So thanks a lot for the invitation. I'll share a bit of a presentation with you because it provides a bit of illustration for some of the things that I'm going to talk about. Can you see the front page here? because if you do, I'll just continue, because I'm starting where Thomas ended, the incredibly challenging position that Afghans are in now. And I'm using this illustration from art lords that I found at Kabul Rock Cafe some years ago, because it's really extremely difficult balancing act. But I will look then more into this with migration pattern, because it's not the first time in history that Afghans have experienced major shocks and turnarounds, and it's not the first time where they have resorted to migration as a way to meet those shocks. But I like to be a bit more broader than it, because to look at different aspects of migration, because we have the labor migration that's been going on for centuries and not least for the last decades. We have the survival, and I'm using one example, so the Khorasan group of Islamic State as one where people are really fleeing for their lives. And then we had this issue of protection that Thomas also mentioned, where recently I think about 200,000 Afghans have been airlifted within a month's time on the assumption that they would face protection needs if during the Taliban regime. But I'll start with my own drawings and try to explain it a bit, because we have to remember that Afghanistan is situated in the middle of Central South Asia. And people, if they're going to leave, it's not like our Norwegians that we can just hop in a boat and row over to England. They need to cross a border to be able to actually to go anywhere. You can say that the border towards the south historically have been a porous one, because there are Pashtuns living on both sides of the border, possibly more in Pakistan than inside Afghanistan. So I see some, it's both work migration, but it's also a bit of seasonal migration. And what I indicated with the yellow lines are a lot of those often Shia Muslims, Dari-speaking Afghans who prefer to go to Iran to do their labor migration, in addition to seeking refugee there. In the south, often Pashtun areas, there were seasonal migration. There were a lot of traveling back and forth across the border to Pakistan for their labor migration. And I also found an increasing number of Afghans, since I started working in Afghanistan in '88, where relatives had been in the Gulf states for a number of years. And when one brother somehow followed the others to increase the income of their families. So it's both language related, religious related, on who Afghan have been traveling where. So that goes for the labor migration. I have no numbers on how many Afghans who have built in a stadium in Qatar over the last years, but I expect that that's quite a few as well. So this is survival economics. It's where you couldn't find any income in Afghanistan. Some parts of the family, male parts mostly, left for neighboring countries to secure that for a longer period of time. Thomas also mentioned, and this is the badly drawn red lines, is seasonal migration by the Afghan nomads. This has generated land conflicts. It has generated areas of fighting where their seasonal migration routes have taken place, which could probably relate to the last mention of Thomas of Daikondi, because the lands and them going back and forth depending on who supported the Pashtun, usually nomads, in their moving. But my main point is that migration has been survival for the Afghans for decades, and it's much more so for the last 40 years. But then something dramatic happened with the Soviet invasion. And I used these figures from UNHCR primarily to look at how this has taken place. Because if we set, let's say around 1979, assume that the Afghan population was around maybe 20 million, at least for a period of time, 5 million of those were refugees in either Iran or in Pakistan. When we came to 1988, there were almost totally more than 6 million refugees here. That was then after the Soviet withdrawal, but when the fighting took place over Kabul. more people left. Kabul was destroyed within 3 to 6 months, and 120,000 of the population were not allowed into Pakistan at that time, but were living in the refugee camps close to the border, where we were providing them support. But then we saw a gradual return even during the Taliban, but not everyone. There were still 2.5 million refugees staying on in Afghanistan, and in Pakistan and Iran. Now, this is also linked to military resistance, because that was built up in both countries, particularly in Pakistan during this time. So the picture of the refugee camp in I've forgotten the name, it's close to Peshawar, were also the place where the resistance were building up and where they were training the people fighting inside of Afghanistan. So it was I think the term refugee warriors where the term we coined on that time by our colleague Astrid Surke. But then we see as the Taliban got harsher towards the end of the 19th, and as Thomas said, a new drought was hitting then as well, more people started to flee. And it was a dramatic movement out of Afghanistan at that time. Then came the US-led invasion at the end of 2001, and returns picked up again to a large scale. But my point is that during history, migration has been a survival mechanism for a large part of the Afghan population. And I think this goes for being it from the north or from the south or central Afghanistan, depending on not only the fighting, but also then the possibility to earn an income has led them to become refugees. And I'm just using this example. It's Norwegian, but it's one of the young Afghans that came here in 2008, but this is very similar for most of those I interviewed later on from 2011 to 15, where there was the large, call it refugee crisis in Europe. A lot of them worked their way. They could have spent years in Iran to earn sufficient income to then move on, worked in Istanbul till they had sufficient money to get into Europe. And then they were back and forth within Europe before someone said it, but maybe no, the refugee policies in Norway is better than in Sweden, and they ended up here. A lot of them were traveling to Europe primarily, and then when borders opened and they didn't have to pay commission for every border they were to cross, the price for getting to Europe dropped dramatically, and more of them saw an opportunity to follow on. So this is what happened at that time. I think there were 2,500 under 18 that came to Norway just in 1 year, and that was a similar in large part of the Europe as well. But then 2001 returned. I think the official figure is that about 5 million Afghans returned during the first year after 2001. There was an incredible optimism, partly push both from Iran and Pakistan's side as well. But people returned home, prospects of development, prospects of a better life in Afghanistan. And this caused a lot of conflicts. In many areas, they returned home and found that the lands had been taken over by others. A family of 2 brothers that I met in Kabul, they came back with 3 trucks with a total family group of 200 people, I think, more or less, when they counted everyone. And it was really a major influx that the international community and the Afghan government at the time was not prepared for. So a lot of new settlements were established, both around Kabul, not least Jalalabad as well. But it brought with it still a lot of optimism and a hope that there would be a new future in Afghanistan for many of them. But this is also a bit what Thomas came into, because while we accepted a lot of these refugees in 2015, when there was a kind of a political move to say that we need to accept refugees both from Syria and from Afghanistan, the governments were taking an increasingly strict measure to it, and the number of people returned, either by assisted programs or forcibly, kept on increasing. This was then also a major criticism leveled against then President Ghani and his acceptance and somehow encouragement for people to come back to the government. And what we saw in Pakistan, and this is an important point that I'll touch upon a bit later when it comes to Turkey as well, a lot of the migration, at least from Pakistan at that time, was that local Pakistani community said that enough is enough. You have stayed here for so many years. Now you need to go back. And so they were actually, this is the quote from 2015. They were saying, we all need to go back at this time. We are tired of this. You have had a lot of support. It's time for you to go home. This was at the time when Taliban again was increasing their hold. This was the time when we saw more attacks in the city. So people were extremely reluctant to return, but there was a push from a lot of populations in Pakistan, and I think the same might be in Iran, saying enough is enough, go home. We did a study on this with assisted return, and what we learned, and which I think is hold relevance for the discussion today as well, is that a lot of people were just coming back to leave again. And they took the opportunity, they saw that security and the future was not what they had hoped for. And then they said, but we have this experience, we know how to get out, we know the smuggling networks, we know how it costs, we know how to find our way. And a lot of those, at least that I interviewed at that time, were planning for a new round of migration. And that knowledge was then also conferred to the family, and more part of them were actually then leaving. Let's also remember that a lot of those who left initially, they didn't come from Afghanistan, they came either from Iran or from Pakistan as refugees or work migrants at that time. So just then a snapshot in 2015, what I just spoke about is that at that time there were at least registered in Pakistan and Iran around 2.5 and probably even larger number of unregistered Afghans. While we found quite a few in the countries north of Afghanistan, we had almost 1 million at that time internally displaced in Afghanistan. And we had numbers as, I think 2015 by sea came 82,500 Afghans to Europe. And also a lot of Pakistanis tried to leave at that time. So already then it was a major attempt to leave Afghanistan for Europe. Just a reminder then of how the situation was in 2020, where almost 1.5 million was in Pakistan, 780,000. These are the official figures. I'm sure there are many more. Germany was the country to have received most Afghans, 181,000. And then came Turkey with, at that time, almost 130,000. And then lower numbers down the line. But this was the situation before everything somehow exploded over the last months. But we have also then seen just on the middle of August, what I would call the mass evacuation. I don't think we have seen anything similar to this since Vietnam. I don't think either. There are very few examples historically of what call a leaving power, bringing along their local staff. There are some knowledge, and maybe Martin know more about that, about France having done it partially. But I think it was on the scale of it and an intensity of this was really a historical dimension to it. And now comes from a protection perspective, some of the challenges, because these were the one who had been able to get close to the international community and somehow render their services there. But it includes also a lot of those who have the biggest bank accounts and probably also have conducted, we could assume, at least if the CIA and the militia forces were among them, some of the worst human rights abuses. So some of the same criteria that we then applied as Europe for the asylum seekers we have accepted before was then not applied in this instance because they were ours. They were the one that needed protection because they worked with us and based on an assumption that Taliban would retaliate against them. So just to bring it up, this is a dilemma in protection discussion. Should we then say no, that everyone that could potentially be having protection needs should be allowed into our countries? Or could we say that we need to scrutinize those who have been brought in with us to say if actually do all of these meet the requirements we have set for other asylum seekers? So to me, the whole debate on asylum and criteria for that somehow has been bypassed in this instance, which probably will hold implication for how we discuss migration and not least asylum. And this brings us today. I'm not going into some of the details because Thomas has already outlined how miserable and challenging the situation is for estimated 36 million population. As we just heard, half of that is in need of humanitarian assistance during the winter. Almost all of them are soon to end over the poverty line. And a lot of them then are really looking into, can we be safe? And even if we can be safe, is there any future here? Will those who haven't had their salaries for the last 3 to 6 months and are not sure that the knowledge will be valued, why on earth should they stay on? What other opportunities then is somehow either internal displacement, which won't serve much except maybe some access to humanitarian assistance, or to leave. The policy taken by neighboring countries up to now is that they won't accept refugees, but I also read in some of the statements that if not supported financially by the international community, so I'm seeing that they are in a more or less of a bargaining situation on it. But I think that we should also then bring into account what I just mentioned. There might not be that much appetite either in Iran or Pakistan to take a new round on Afghan refugees this time, either politically or in the population. Then a lot of people have been on the way towards Turkey for a long period of time. More are probably on the way at the moment, but Turkey are doing two things. They have built the wall and they are at least officially closing the border towards Iran, so there shouldn't be an access in. And they are again questioning how will they, if they will, allow Afghans to leave Turkey towards Europe, because now we have the Turkey EU agreement on Syrian refugees, somehow giving Turkey the role as gatekeepers towards a certain price paid by the European countries. And the question is, will the Afghans then end up being the same kind of bargaining tool for Turkey, to be cynical here, in the bargaining with the EU? They are at the moment, when speaking to friends now in Turkey, saying that the poorer Afghans are facing an extremely difficult time because they are then trying to compete with the poorer, increasingly poorer Turkish population as well onto jobs. Those who are a bit well off and who have had their children into school and universities are looked upon more favorably because they are adding to the Turkish economy. But Turkey is extremely crucial here then if we think about further migration towards Europe. Even if there are back doors open now and we see people coming in, as surely Rolanta will talk about, towards other parts of Europe, they are the one who hold the mass migration towards Europe. So in a way, Afghans have historically moved to survive. 2, they have a lot of experience in moving. There is a well-established smuggling network in place for those who have money. And there is then question of how things develop in Afghanistan, really. But this then goes also for the international community's approach to, and even if they don't want to recognize the Taliban government or provide any funding for it, can it be an opening for providing more than just humanitarian assistance, which only will be short-term band aid? So all of these things are really up, and I agree with Thomas. It's equally about our responsibility as it's about the Taliban and former Afghan government's responsibility, because somehow how to handle this. And to me, it's not only the fear of more Afghans coming to Europe, it's the fear of what will happen to the Afghans who are behind in Afghanistan, the poorest segment of the population that possibly won't afford to leave Afghanistan. So it's a practical moral dilemma that the UN, the international agencies and the NGOs and politicians in all our countries are struggling with at the moment, but need to find a solution for rather quickly before people start to die of hunger. Thank you.
Excellent, Arne, and thanks a lot, and thanks also for that final sentence where you reminded us that in this crisis, as in most other crises around the world, the very poorest, the most desolate, I mean, they will not be able to move. They will be left behind, and then my fear is that they will add to this increasing number of the world's invisible population, because they are not seen, because they do not enter Europe or other richer terrain, and therefore are just left behind in all possible humanitarian / political calculations. So thanks for reminding us about that. We should move on quickly to Jolanta, and hopefully we'll have some time towards the very end for some Q&A, and we also have a very recent Afghan refugee who in fact says that he was at the palace when the palace fell in Kabul. So I would very much also like to see if we can find a little space towards the end for that person to address us. But Jolanta, please first.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Arne and Thomas, for your very interesting presentations. As I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, but rather expert on European Union migration, in my short intervention, I will try to focus on the impact of current crisis in Afghanistan on EU migration policy. But first, let me make a short overview of EU situation with regard to Afghans. Quite a short history of statistics of Afghans' presence in Europe. As you all know, Afghans quite often enter EU territory irregularly. In the recent years, they were usually using this Eastern Mediterranean road leading through Turkey to Greece. Now we are facing a little change also, and we can see and feel it in Poland, as on eastern border to the European Union through Belarus. The Afghans are the second biggest group of people who cross these borders, according to Polish border guards. That's why here in Poland we are especially interested in the development of the situation and the impact of Afghan crisis on the situation in the future, especially taking into consideration this instrumentalization of migration by Minsk regime. The peak of Afghans' arrivals was noted in the European Union during the crisis of 2015, when the number of cases exceeded 200,000. Last year, it was only 10,000 of Afghans entering EU territory irregularly. So it was more than 8% of all attempts to cross the border in this irregular manner. Afghans are also among the top applicants for international protection in the European Union. Last year, nearly 50,000 of Afghans applied for asylum, what placed them in the second position among the largest groups of applicants in the European Union, after Syrians with 70,000 applications. At the same time, only half of Afghan applicants receive a positive decision on international protection in the European Union. Last year, it was 53%. And this recognition rate differ depending on the country, the member state. For example, in 2020, the recognition rate for Afghan citizens at first instance ranged from 1% in Bulgaria to 94% 3% in Italy. So it's a huge difference. And member states are trying to turn back Afghans who are not able to grant protection. In 2016, the EU conducted a non-binding agreement with Afghanistan on migration, the joint way forward on migration issues between Afghanistan and the European Union. And through special measures and regional migration programs, EU has been supporting voluntary returns of Afghans and reintegration of returnees and internally displaced persons. It's good to say that returns to Afghanistan have been organized despite the security and economic situation in the country and despite many protests of NGOs and humanitarian organizations. Some EU countries conducted this policy until the fall of the government in Kabul in August. But when the Taliban took full power, the return policy was suspended, and it's now, of course, difficult to expect that the situation will enable to restart this policy. But it's good to stress, on the other hand, that in recent years, the effects of EU return policy to Afghanistan were very limited. In 2014, 2018, every year around 4,000 Afghans were returned home from the European Union. At the same time, the index of people who were not effectively returned was over 25,000 annually. So it's a huge number of people who are not effectively returned. And the current crisis in Afghanistan may, of course, further increase the risk of forced displacement, migratory flows in the region, and also migrant smuggling towards the European Union. So the EU countries try to prepare themselves for this challenge. But first, European Union stopped development aid for the country. The EU payments for the next years, for 2021-2024, was made conditional on talks with the Taliban and their respect for international law and human rights. The suspension of support did not apply to humanitarian aid. Moreover, in the recent State of the Union address, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, announced an increase in aid by 100 million euros as part of broader package for Afghanistan and its neighbors to prevent humanitarian disaster. And today, actually, the EU high-level forum focusing on providing protection to Afghans at risk will take place, bringing together ministers of foreign affairs and ministers of interior, and they are going to discuss comprehensive solutions for Afghans most in need of international protection. And topics will include both the future EU resettlement efforts, the community sponsorship or admission for studies or work, the EU financial support to match political commitments and integration efforts of the member states. And it's quite sure that EU will probably give particular attention to Afghan human rights defenders, professionals of the justice system, journalists and civil society activists whose lives are at stake. In line with the Council conclusion from the end of September, EU will also initiate a regional platform, political platform of cooperation with Afghanistan's direct neighbors to help prevent the negative spillover effect in the region and support the economic resilience and economic cooperation, as well as humanitarian and protection needs. For me, as an expert on migration, is also interesting how the situation may affect the negotiation of EU asylum package. And I think this is not only interesting for me, but it's very crucial for the future of EU migration policy as such. From the one hand, the increasing number of Afghans crossing the eastern border of the European Union, coming to Lithuania, Latvia, coming to Poland, so coming to countries that are traditionally skeptical about the solidarity mechanism proposed by the European Commission, could be a factor facilitating reaching agreement on European migration policy. This asylum system, this new asylum system that is expected to replace the Dublin system. But Belarus' involvement in stimulating the crisis on eastern border of the EU, however, obscures this humanitarian dimension of the phenomenon. So the EU reaction is actually limited to countering illegal migration, including the use of tools of diplomatic and financial pressure on the Belarus authorities, without bringing any progress in negotiation on asylum system. So to sum up, I would like to say that this short-term strategy of the European Union, in my opinion, will focus on supporting neighborhood countries of Afghanistan, creating legal paths for some group of migrants from Afghanistan, but I think it's really difficult to expect the crucial change in EU migration policy as such, the EU migration policy, and I think that we already during the first weeks after the crisis could observe that it's not so easy to make this huge change in EU migration policy. I think we still remember the negative impact on political situation of the migration crisis of 2015. I mean, decision makers remember this negative impact, and they will try to avoid making any bigger steps in this asylum system, rather focusing on preventing irregular migration and as I mentioned, stopping migration by cooperation with neighborhood countries. So thank you, and I will just leave a space for some questions.
Thank you, Jolanta. Thank you so much. This was also very enlightening. So thanks a lot for adding that dimension and also reminding us about the legacy of the 2015 mishandling, I would say. I mean, some talk about this as the 2015 as the European refugee crisis. I think that is basically wrong. It was the inability of Europe to handle this. I mean, the refugee crisis in itself is probably everywhere else than in Europe, at least in 2015. But it certainly, and I agree with you, has left a legacy among the political leadership that will continue to inform how they will try to deal with it if a new great wave of migrants and refugees should come towards Europe. So far, I mean, at least as I can see, that is not materializing, at least not as it did in 2015. And I'm not really certain it will either. But turning to the Q&A, and we have basically around 15 minutes, so it's not much time left. But so how I'm going to treat this is basically that there's been a lively chat here, and I would sort of encourage everybody to have a look at what has been written there, and please engage with some of it if you like. But many of the issues addressed raised in the chat has been addressed by the panelists as during their presentations. So what I will do is that I'm going to take out a few issues from the chat and pose it to the panelists, address what you would like. But before you start addressing them, we have a very recent Afghan refugee who is just, as far as I can understand from the chat, has just arrived in Poland. The name is Bagtash Kargar. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And I would like to give Bagtash just a couple of minutes to get what kind of views on what has been heard here, basically. But the question is from Malin Sunde. She asks about Taliban coherence. How coherent is Taliban in your point of view? Is there a chance of it disintegrating? What's the chance of the monopoly of violence that it's aiming for, that it will be achieved and that it will hold, I think is the question. There is a slightly similar question from Maciej Pawlowski about what is the local support for Taliban among the Afghan population? Is it widespread? Is it ethnically divided? So on and so forth. And secondly, it is asked, can we come to an agreement with Taliban? I think what's behind this question is basically, I mean, should European Union countries and others start recognizing Taliban as a government? And if so, what are the pros and what are the cons regarding this? And thirdly, from the same person, which was sort of mentioned in the passing, I think both by Arne and Thomas, but not sort of tackled straight on, and that is the issue of Russia. And to what extent is Taliban also a problem and a challenge for Russia? And I'm suggesting then, meaning, what is the chances there for some international coordinated action around the new situation that has emerged in Afghanistan? Finally, to Jolanta, I mean, I think it would be interesting if you could elaborate a little bit more on the possibilities for the EU to act more in a more coordinated manner this time than what we have seen in the past, and what are the barriers against such a more coordinated EU action. But first, Bagtash, if you are here,
yes.
I will allow you a couple of minutes, but we are running short on time, so
yes.
I'm sorry, 3 minutes.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate, and thanks for your precious time. This was a very interesting discussion from the topic and the contents I was following. Thanks for the time and opportunity to give me speak. I am here. I'm very glad to be here to talk from the perspective of a former Afghan analyst in National Security Council, I worked as an advisor in different levels, and also one of educated youth Afghans, and also one of the recent Afghan refugees who were immigrated to Poland or Europe. I had some things or some recommendations to talk about, but since we are short in time, first of all, I go to answer the questions, and if I still have a minute or half, I will raise a few other things. Regarding the possibilities of Taliban to be integrated, or people's what the local people think in Afghanistan, I think we had a great chance during Doha talks, but unfortunately we have missed that. That was the greatest time. But still, we have the chance to negotiate with them, give them political and diplomatic pressures for them. Taliban, in exchange to continuous financial support, in exchange to recognize them. We should not leave Afghan people alone. Actually, if we say what has happened, it is not a correct way to address. It is still happening. People are still the victims. People are suffering. We should not. We should remember that what is happening about women's rights, human rights, people, they are suffering from hunger. There is a very serious economic, socio-economic crisis going on in Afghanistan. People, they don't have access to their own bank accounts, and so many other social problems. And also, what do you think about such a big flow of the Afghan educated, bright-minded people that they are lots of investments have happened on them, and now they are just leaving Afghanistan? What will happen to a country without such people? We are international society are responsible to act on it, to prevent for more damages in Afghanistan that will be not easy to recover anytime soon. And I think not only the European Union, also China, Russia, those countries, they can also be victims in the future if they do not act on time now. Also, in Afghanistan, we shouldn't think only about the Taliban. When I was working there, we were working on different, what I think it's not secret anymore. There are more than 20 terrorist groups in Afghanistan active, and they can be threat to neighboring countries and to the entire world, especially to the region. And they were active under the Taliban shelter, and they are more active now. They could be threat to those countries like ETIM, IMU, TTP, LET, and there are many more. Okay. Also, as a refugee or migrant, I had some recommendations. First, if we could find solutions, escaping and evacuating Afghans are not only solutions, they are not very helpful. I think we should, as I said, we should give more pressure on Taliban regime and all of them in order to stop what is happening at the moment. And United Nations, European Unions, US, China, all those superpowers, this is time to act. It's still not late, but it is getting late. We have to act more responsibly for the victims. And about the refugees, I think thanks to international society, European Union, for giving all the refugees the international protection. As I am one of them, today I submitted the second part of my forms to get the status. But Afghan refugees, they need besides financial support, they need some more support. They have some legal problems. For example, only one can leave the country, but they left all their hopes, their house, their family. Some of their family members are back there. They cannot go back and they cannot bring them here because the procedures, legal, it's understandable, but very difficult and complicated. And because of such procedures, they cannot reunion with their families. They are facing mental problems or lots of psychological problems. And also, we should not always think refugees as challenges. Sometimes we can change the challenges into opportunities. We can not only give them shelter or some financial support, we can use them in some think tanks. We should use their and grant them opportunity to work in a society even before they get some certain documents. I'm sorry, I understand the time is very limited. I appreciate your time and thanks a lot. I have more things, maybe I will have more chances to say my words. Thanks a lot, I appreciate. And if there are any questions regarding the previous governments, the reasons of collapse, the Taliban, and all the things I was somehow involved in, I am always there to answer the questions. Thank
you, Bagtash, and thanks for sharing your views with us. And at least from my side, I wish you the best of luck with your with everything right now in Poland, and also my full sympathy for your family or whoever you have left behind in Afghanistan. I understand that this is, of course, an extremely challenging situation, also emotionally. Before the last round of, which has to be very short responses from the panelists, Patrick, you had something on your mind as well.
Thank you very much. I just would like to add to this fascinating discussion 2 or 3 very sharp questions. First of all, as I understand from your remarks, without the resumption of international development assistance and unfreezing the foreign assets of the Afghan government, we are facing the collapse of the economy and major humanitarian crisis. So the question is, what's your personal opinion, Arne and Thomas? Should the West resume the international aid now or in the foreseeable future, under what conditions? Second, to Arne, you underlined the importance of the southern way through Turkey for eventual migration from Afghanistan to Europe. But what are the prospects of using the northern route to Europe through the Central Asian republics, and then further on through Russia to eastern borders of Europe, to Poland and other countries? What are the obstacles on the way? I understand the countries are not very welcoming at the moment, but everything can change in the Central Asian republics, I guess. And to add to this, I understand that the policy of the European Union will be to keep eventual possible refugee population from Afghanistan closest to Afghanistan, that is in the neighboring countries, who are already hosting a number of refugees and might be unwilling to receive any more. So what are the incentives that the Europe has to encourage the Pakistan or Afghanistan or other Central Asian republics to receive more refugees if the need arises, and to keep them on their territory, which is, I understand, the idea, the plan for the European Union. Whether money is enough, or what other things you think can work in this bargaining with countries neighboring Afghanistan? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. And then I give the the floor back to the panelists. I will ask you to be short, so let's say 2 minutes each, and then we start in the opposite direction with Jolanta, and then Arne and Thomas towards the end. So Jolanta, the floor is yours. There has been a number of questions, so just what you like in the 2 minutes that you have at your disposal.
Okay, thank you very much. So first, I will try to respond to your question. I would say that this time we can observe rather the quite coordinated response of the European Union. Governments are rather not brave enough to say that they will welcome all the refugees and open their borders. It's very funny somehow when I look at this political public discourse on migrants from Afghanistan or refugees from Afghanistan, that we look completely different on people who fly from Kabul and are evacuated and call them our friends, and completely different approach we have towards people who just come irregularly to our borders, although probably there are the same reasons and motivations of their travel. So this time I think this approach is much more coordinated, and the very sad, I think, lesson that we have learned is that it's better only for political reason, internal political reasons, to keep migrants away from European borders. Although I think the very bitter lesson that we can learn now from the migration crisis of 2015 is that European Union can be easily blackmailed by the issue of migration, and we should face, I think, this challenge also. Yeah, I think that this time this approach will be more coordinated, but focused more on this external dimension of strategy. The second question came from Konrad Pędziwiatr in the chat about the differences in member state approaches to refugees and different recognition rates of applications. I would say that European institutions try to make the asylum system closer to each other. We have some directives, and as you, as an expert on migration, you know them already, I'm sure, but here is the issue of sensitivity of member states in this asylum policy. I think that every time member states stressed that the procedure is individual, so the response of every member state and the effect of the procedure may be different. I think that in this recent proposal of the European Commission, there is an proposal of pre-screening procedure, pre-screening on the external border of European Union. If we would implement this kind of procedure, I think that this would make the procedures more similar in the member states, because the first selection would take place on the external borders. So the further steps will be, and outcome of further steps would be more similar for sure. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jolanta. Arne, over to you.
Yeah, some quick responses. I think there were some very good questions from Malin here, but I hope Thomas will relate to that. But I think what we need to take in over us, that there is a political shift here where the US have withdrawn from this part of the world. China is still their enemy, but they are not confronting them in Central Asia. They are confronting them on the sea. And that holds strong policy implication, I think, also for the EU's willingness, at least the EU, UK and some other states' willingness to engage. That gives that's a clue towards where the question about Russia. But I will say a bit about aid before, because it's a question about not necessarily providing aid through the Taliban government, but there is a need to talk with the Taliban government to be able to provide aid to the Afghans. Humanitarian assistance is quite straightforward. That is what's handled in a lot of other countries as well. It's the desperate need for something that is just band aid, which goes for salaries of teachers, health workers, community workers, and all of that needs to be handled. There are mechanisms that can be used for it, through channeling fund, through trust funds and things like that. We need to find a way to do that. If you do that, and there is a joint approach to it, a lot can be done. Then to the last, because yes, Russia is then taking a larger role in the region, but they don't have much funding, and they really don't want more Afghan refugees to cross through their territories and areas. So I don't think the northern route, it was used last round, but not very extensively. And I think they will fear that a lot of people who might like to leave Afghanistan is not the one that they want through the borders. They are equally concerned about IS, which a lot of them were recruited from these areas, and they fear that might come back through Russia, not through Afghanistan, towards Central Asia and Russia. So I think there will be a lot of reluctance in accepting it. But it's a question, if EU want to put a lot of money into refugee settlements in all neighboring countries or other states, there will be an opening for it. But I think there is less of an appetite in the neighboring countries for accepting more Afghan refugees at the moment. Sorry, but that's my questions.
Thank you, Arne. And then finally, Thomas, 2 final minutes to you.
Okay, thanks. I try to be brief. On aid, I fully am d'accord with Arne, so nothing to say about that. Are the Taliban a threat to Russia? No, they aren't. And I think Russia also has understood that, is accommodating with the Taliban, as do Iran, China, the US, almost everyone else. Because it's more about IS and the globally aspirational jihadist groups, not the national Islamists as the Taliban. Taliban coherence, and are they in control? If they're not in control of their own people, doesn't mean that they're not in control of Afghanistan, and I think they are. Because all those different groups in the Taliban who behave differently on that or this topic still control Afghanistan in the name of the Taliban. And they also, there was something like a psychological warfare ongoing for 20 years. Oh, the Taliban are so incoherent and so on. And we saw that they were very coherent in taking over power. And I think they won't risk that. That's probably also one of the reasons why they give free hand to some of the people in some areas who are not towing the exact line on education or beards or whatever somewhere else in the country. What's the Taliban support? I mean, that's very difficult to answer because we don't have polls in Afghanistan which are reliable. But the thing is that even in non-representative polls, which Afghan institutes who were clearly pro-government did, usually had a quota of between 5 and 12% of the respondents saying that they have some sympathy for the Taliban. So I think there is a portion. But what's more important is it's the power of persuasion by force what the Taliban have. So there's no chance to say something against them. So people either just resignate and agree and accommodate with them, apart from those who actually share more or less of the ideological basis of the Taliban, I would say. And what also came out from many media reports over the past weeks and months is that even in the cities, when the Taliban came, a lot of people came out of their houses and actually took the side of the Taliban, whether they were old Taliban or just new converts or just adopting to the new reality. That's everyone's guess. But I think their influence and also number of followers was larger than we assumed, and that's probably also part of the failure in predicting how the Taliban would come out. Yeah, I think that were the questions which went to my direction. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Thomas, and thanks to Jolanta and Arne as well. I think this has we are 10 minutes over the time. I allow that to happen because I think this was a very well worth time spent for me, but I hope also for the panelists and for the audience and for Patrick. What is left for me is just to say thank you to all three of you. Thank you to our participants who posed very lively and very pertinent questions at the chat function. I hope that part of that dialogue and debate will continue after we close this seminar. And I would also like to thank Patrick and Jolanta for the cooperation between NUPI and PISM. Patrick, any final words from you before we close this?
No, not really, except that I would like to thank our speakers and all the audience and everyone participating and watching this debate. I only wish we had much more time because we just touched a little bit of the subject, so it would need much more time and attention, and possibly we will continue to look at this issue in the future, and Afghanistan will stay with us and as a topic of research for many years. And I hope the less is better, but I believe we will need to pay more and more attention to Afghanistan in coming months and years, which gives us an opportunity also to continue our cooperation. And I hope to meet Arne and Thomas and others more often in the future. And thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon. See you soon on other events.
With that said, thank you, and the seminar will now be closed, but I hope that the debate will continue because it really needs to continue. So thank you all and have a lovely